This chart shows the question that I worked on for the first 2 decades of my career as an economist. What it illustrates is changes in wages over time. How much could you get if you spent an hour working at various points in human history? It's, for the time scale that I want to look at, it's not useful to try and measure wages in any kind of currency unit or use currency units adjusted for a price index, because we don't have those going back far enough. So what it measures is the amount of light that a worker could acquire at various points in time by working for an hour. These data were collected, by the way, by William Nordhaus, a very clever economist from Yale. The first thing that you should note about this graph is that the amount of light that you can acquire, that an average worker can acquire based on an hour of work today, is literally many orders of magnitude larger than it was in earlier parts of human history. So the magnitude of the change is really quite astonishing. But the question that obsessed me was, why has the rate of improvement, why has the rate of growth in our standard of living or our wages been speeding up over time? In a chart like this, where the vertical axis is a ratio scale, the slope of the line tells you something about the rate of growth. And what's most striking about this diagram is the increase in the rate of growth over time. So as Steve suggested, we understand that it has to be the power of ideas that makes possible this improvement in standards of living. We know that physical objects are scarce, and there's a lot more of us now sharing the same set of physical objects. So there has to be something else that offsets the scarcity of the objects, and indeed, it's the potential for discovery. But that doesn't explain why, that potential for discovery has always been there, doesn't explain why that process of discovery has been speeding up over time. And that, as I said, was the focus of the first 20 years of my work. Now, I thought it would be useful to start with this chart today, because we're at a time which is actually quite similar to the time when I first started thinking about this question. Around 1980, when I was in graduate school, we were in the midst of another macroeconomic crisis. At that point, the very real concern was whether we would ever get inflation under control. It was also a time where there was pervasive fear that resource scarcity of energy in particular, would not only stop the growth process, but in fact lead to a serious decline in standards of living. Now, we managed the macroeconomic crisis of the time, and we realized that those fears about resource scarcity were wrong, just as they've been wrong all throughout human history. And we need to keep that kind of slightly broader, longer-term perspective in mind as we face the issues of the day. Crisis management is extremely important. I don't want to understate at all the seriousness of the challenges, the macro challenges that we face right now. And crisis prevention has to be a very important part of the agenda in coming years. Once we get out of the emergency right now, we need to think hard about how can we change our systems so that we are not at the same kind of risk of having another crisis like this. But even as we pay attention to those things, I think we have to keep attention on the deeper issues, the deeper mechanisms that underlie human progress. And that will be my focus today. We need to approach those questions with not the kind of pessimism that leads to hopelessness and apathy, nor the kind of alarm that leads to a kind of an emergency response. We also don't want to have the kind of optimism that leads to complacency about these issues, but we do want to maintain that kind of optimism that makes us ambitious, makes us willing to take risks and keep driving farther up for everyone. So, in my work on that question about speeding up, there was both a pure research question about what makes it possible, but then also a series of questions about, if we understand what makes it possible, could we speed this process up even more? Could we take some actions that could lead to faster growth? That led primarily to a focus on policies in what the countries you might call the top billion, the countries where the richest billion people in the world live. And in thinking about those policies, one is led inevitably to focus on questions about technology and the drivers of improvements in science and technology, and also to think about education and its role in driving that process of improvement in technology and making sure that everybody participates in the gains from the technology. So I spent time thinking about the deep research questions and practical policy questions. I didn't spend very much time on those practical policy questions, but I have to say that I have enormous respect for people like Condi, or Eddie Lazear, or Mike Boskin, or George Shultz, who've spent many years of their lives on those practical questions. Let me just tell you one story that illustrates why you have to have a strong heart to really work on those policy questions. I was involved in some conversations with people in the Congress about ways we could actually improve our educational system and speed up the rate of technological change. Specific policies directed at increasing the number of young people from North America or from the United States who got degrees in science and engineering. Through those discussions, we crafted a bill that was going to address this issue, and I think an innovative way. We had bipartisan support for this bill, so there was both a Republican and a Democrat from the House, and then bicameral, so another Republican and Democrat from the Senate who had signed on as sponsors of this bill. The morning when I was in Washington to go to the press conference to announce this bill, I was working away without even actually being connected to the internet at that time. And I got a phone call saying, Paul, the press conference has been canceled. There was an airplane that just crashed into a building in New York City, and everything is locked down. So that bill died, and attention moved on to other concerns. And it's, I think, indicative of what life is like in the policy world. You can't control the agenda sometimes. Events overtake you, and it sometimes can break your heart. So it's like Condi's story about the Middle East. It's very hard to do that kind of work. But it's very important because it's the combination of both the basic inquiry, what's really going on here, and then the practical problem solving, what can we do with this knowledge, that really drives progress. Now, I've shifted my focus to a different kind of concern. Starting from that practical end, my current concern is how could we raise standards of living, improve the quality of life in the set of countries which Paul Collier has called the bottom billion. So take the countries in which the poorest billion people on Earth live and ask, what could we do to help them? And I want to correct one small interpretation of this. This is not a question about what should we do in Africa, because there are many of the countries of the bottom billion countries currently happen to be located in Africa. But if we were having this conversation in the 1930s, we would have put much more focus on the bottom billion countries in Asia, and China would have been one of those places where we were most concerned. And we would have had discussion, there was discussion in the press at the time about should we give foreign aid, or is aid just feeding corruption? How will we ever deal with the instability? So this is not, it happens to be a regional question at any point in time, but it's really a much more systematic question about this vague concept governance, which Condi alluded to, and which was in my title, and which I want to try and unpack in the talk today. So what we want to do is adopt this approach that Donald Stokes, who was a political scientist at Princeton, identified as the Pasteur approach to progress. Louis Pasteur was somebody who worked on very practical problems. Napoleon said, look, I got to have a way for my soldiers to carry food that doesn't spoil when they march. And Pasteur developed pasteurization, but also the whole theory of microbiology in response to trying to solve that problem. So it was both this attention to practical problems and deep insights. We want to take that kind of approach and apply it to the question of how to help people in the bottom billion.